We begin by now understanding that a God-created covenant is nothing less than a new or modified law of nature. And while the analogy might not be perfect in every sense, there is no other word we can come up with that expresses the unfathomable cosmic force of a covenant offered and guaranteed by the Creator. A promise, a contract, a doctrine, a will, and a testament, these are all just weak and inferior man-centered devices, as flawed and apt to break down as the humans who conjured them up and agreed to them. On the other hand, a covenant of God has at its source the very Spirit of God. Therefore, of anything that mankind is aware, nothing can be as inalterable and certain as that the purpose of a divine covenant will be carried out. So by means of accepting the separation God insists upon in verse 4 of Genesis 12, that's how Abraham ratified the covenant that God made with him. That was the ratification. In other words, simply by leaving Haran and his family and his nation and going to Canaan, Abraham fulfilled his part of the deal. The entire remainder of the terms of that covenant, terms which would take centuries to develop and come about, all of that was on God. It was utterly impossible for Abraham now to fail to break the covenant because the whole rest of it wasn't up to Abraham. This is perhaps the best definition of what a permanent covenant is. It's all on God. It's unilateral. A quick biblical rule about covenants. If man or nature has to continue upholding some part of that covenant in order for it to remain valid, then it's a conditional covenant, which means it can be broken, and therefore a consequence would come about. Well, this newfound wealth that Abraham had received from his adventure to Egypt soon presented some unanticipated problems between Lot, his nephew, and Abraham. It seems that God had blessed them so much, as he promised them he would do, that their herds and their flocks of livestock had increased to the point there was no longer sufficient pasture lands or water to sustain them all. So fights started breaking out among the herdsmen. Abraham makes a decision. They must separate. And in a generous and godly act, Abraham tells Lot he may choose what portion of the land he wants for himself. Abraham will take what's left. So Lot takes his wealth, and he goes to the rich lands of the Jordan River Valley. He settles, though, towards the far southern end of the Dead Sea at Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham in the fields and the hill country of Canaan, Lot in the cities of the valley. Another division and separation is occurring. Abraham is being further separated from unrighteousness that haunts the soul, as we're soon going to see, of Lot. The city of Sodom was a notoriously wicked place. Lot well knew that. That's why he chose it. It's undoubtedly why he was drawn to it. And I have little doubt that the older and much wiser Abraham knew exactly what Lot was going to choose when he asked him. Well, after Abraham separates himself from Lot, Jehovah speaks to Abraham as if to reinforce the godliness and wisdom of that decision. God now adds some details to the terms of the covenant he's already made with Abraham by telling him in verse 15 that all the land that Abraham sees in every direction will belong to him and his descendants, and it will be their land, in Hebrew, Ad Olam. Ad Olam. Ad Olam is a common Hebrew term that means forever. perpetual, never ending. Those aren't my words. Those are God's words. So a new law of the universe has just been decreed as regards the land and as regards the number of Abraham's descendants in the form of a permanent, not a conditional covenant. God didn't say, if you'll do this, I'll do that. There was no amount of sin, no level of rebellion that Abraham or his descendants could commit that would cause God to rescind that covenant. And over again, the prophets remind us of that fact in Holy Scripture. Yet for the last several hundred years, much of the church has said that Abraham's covenant no longer exists. That God has instead disposed of his promise to Abraham and essentially turned it over to Gentile Christians as the new Israel. It's nonsense. Most certainly, Jehovah warned that the Hebrew people would be removed from their land for a time because of their lusting after other gods. But never were they ever going to be permanently removed from that land. And that is made abundantly clear in both the Old Testament and the New. Of all the scriptures I've ever read concerning the return of Israel, all Israel, to their land, the one that strikes my heart the deepest is Ezekiel chapters 36 and 37. And we're going to take that up in our next lesson.